Today I want to talk to y'all about the truth behind 60 frames per second. And the truth is, it is not meant to be played back at 60 frames per second. Alright, so I'm going to be completely honest with you all. I know a lot of YouTubers who use 60 frames per second in their playback on YouTube. I know a lot of people who like to shoot in 60 frames per second. I know a lot of people who don't even know what 60 frames per second means. But today I wanted to explain this to you all so that you all can know what it's supposed to be meant for and also what should and shouldn't be done with 60 frames per second. Now, at the end of the day, you can do whatever you want to do with 60 frames per second, but the reason why I'm doing this is because it should be done a certain way. From the beginning of ancient times. I'm just kidding, it wasn't that long ago. But honestly, from the beginning of when film was made, it was meant to be able to be displayed at the right frame rate for our eyes to see. And they came up with the standard format of 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, depending on where your location is. But those two numbers are the top numbers for cinematic and human eye to see as far as frame rate goes. Now, then we came out with 30 frames per second, and that was normally for TV, and that was just to give you a couple extra frames pretty much so that you wouldn't miss anything when you're watching TV. Now, with that being said, our eyes only see a certain amount of frames. So if you go all the way up to 60 frames per second, we aren't gonna see all 60 frames per second. We're gonna see extra frames because we don't know exactly how many frames we see, or at least I don't know exactly how many frames we see, but 60 frames per second looks all extra smooth to us because there are extra frames there. There's 30 extra frames that technically don't even need to be there for our eyes to see. And there's a certain number to where our eyes literally won't be able to see it. It looks smooth to the average eye because they don't know what they're looking at exactly as far as frames go, but it's not meant to be played back at that speed. And for someone like me who's an editor or someone that's deep into video and things like that, if they're watching your content or they're watching your videos and they see that super fast frame rate and there's no purpose behind it, then they're gonna be like, why am I watching this? 60 frames per second was made so that you can do slow motion if you want to get those nice slow shots, and actually 120 frames per second will be even better, but 60 frames per second will also get you slow-mo. And then also for gaming, so that you can see more frames of the gameplay and not have to see choppy footage when you're watching someone play. You can get more of a realistic experience. Now also the last thing that 60 frames per second is also really good for is sports. If you're watching sports and you don't want to miss a detail of watching sports, then playing it back at 60 frames per second will actually be a very smart idea. Therefore you should shoot it at 60 frames per second or even 120 so that you can slow it down to 60 if you need to slow it down. So this is just something that's really good for using with 60 frames per second, but you shouldn't be doing vlogs, tutorials, things like that involve you and your camera just sitting there, not really doing anything special. You shouldn't be shooting at 60 frames per second. Nobody needs to see you sitting in 60 frames per second, to be honest. You can do that with 24 frames or 30 frames per second, and it'll look even better, actually. It'll look more natural, it'll look more cinematic. 24 frames per second is cinematic, as I said earlier, and 30 frames is what TV goes by. So these are the two things that we're used to seeing with our eyes. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, it's really unneeded unless you have a really good purpose for it, like gaming, being outside doing sports, or if you want to do slow motion shots. Now, wrapping this all up together, there is nothing that I can say to anyone who does their own videos about what they need to do with them. I just wanted to make this video addressing the actual truth behind 60 frames per second and why I feel videos should only be 60 frames per second if they are fulfilling a certain need for 60 frames per second. People play back videos at 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, and then they shoot it at 60 frames per second so that they can then slow down the time to 30 frames or 24 frames per second. And just to add an extra bonus to this whole video, if you think about it, frame rate is what controls your shutter speed. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/48th, all right? Because that's going to be double the amount of your frame rate. But sometimes you'll just have to go to 150. Like right now I'm shooting at 150 shutter speed only because I'm using an entry-level DSLR and I can't make it go to 48. Now if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, then you need to have your shutter speed at 1/60th. Every time you do this, you're just going to double your frame rate to the nearest number that you can. 60 frames per second should have a shutter speed of 120, and then so on. Just keep doubling it. Now if you keep doing that, your shutter speed, if it keeps going up, that's going to make your footage darker. So if you're going to shoot at 60 frames per second, you're actually limiting yourself for the amount of light that you're going to have in your video. So if you want your video to look the best and have the most detail, then you should be shooting at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, because then you can get even more light, and light is what controls the detail in your image. 60 frames per second, yes, it will get you smooth footage, But smooth is not what adds detail to your footage. All right, so if there's anything I want you to remember, smoothness does not provide quality or detail to your video image. If you're worried about detail and quality for your image, then you should be using 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, because this will get you the most amount of light that you can see, and your footage will look the most natural that it would for your video, instead of using something that's a higher frame rate, which would not look natural. If you think about it, the movie Hobbit that came out years ago, I actually sold tickets for that because I used to work at AMC. If you remember that film, it actually didn't do that well in its high frame rate. People just weren't used to seeing video or movies at that high of a frame rate. So their actual normal footage and the normal IMAX, all that, for the movie Hobbit, The Hobbit, it was actually a lot better, and it sold more tickets for that version rather than their high-speed version. So when you're posting these videos on YouTube, keep this in mind. And I just wanted everyone to know this because I wanted to give the history behind it and also just explain it a little bit more. Sorry if this seemed like a really big rant video, but it's just something that I've noticed a lot and I wanted to address it so that people can understand. So sorry for posting a video late this week, but I got a little bit busy working and everything like that, but I wanted to get this content out to you all so you can see my opinion on this epidemic here. And like I always say, thanks for watching this video. I really hope you felt like it was useful. Please let me know down below in the comments if you have anything else you want to know about 60 frames per second, or what your stance is on 60 frames per second. Do you like 24 frames per second more, or 25 if you're in another country? Do you like 30 frames per second more, or do you really like 60 frames per second? So like I always say, thanks for watching this video. Comment down below, like it, and please go ahead and subscribe to the channel so that I can continue making quality content for you all to see. And like I always say, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.